fine, and that if you can't hear me, that someone's going to let me know. So first of all, thank you very much for letting me join in to your excellent showcase from remote, from here in New Zealand. I'm coming to you live from Wellington right now, and I'm based in Wellington right now on a 12-week experiment, a government experiment to explore what true digital transformation could look like. So I'm going to take you on that journey. I've got some slides to share with you, so I might skip back and forth between the slides. So I'll bring them up right now, and I'll show you some interesting things. So just to introduce myself, my name's Pia Waugh. I currently work primarily in the in the Australian government, should I say, and I primarily work on. I've been in this space for a while. So I was 9 years in the private sector originally. Then I worked for a minister/senator for a few years in IT policy guidance and advice, and since then I've been working in the federal government in Australia for the last 5 years, really focused on this idea of how to make government better, how to make government, how government uses technology, how government serves the community, how government engages with the community. So government as a platform is not a new idea. It was an idea that was a term coined actually by Tim O'Reilly 9 years ago, almost 9 years ago. And at the time I was deeply involved in the emergence of the Gov 2.0 agenda in Australia and in the federal government. And there was a lot of really great work and thinking at the time. Unfortunately, what we saw happen was that Gov as a platform became misinterpreted by a lot of people. We saw a lot of Gov as a platform being interpreted as just common platforms, shared platforms, setting up, shared content management systems or shared services. And it unfortunately completely missed the point. And meanwhile, we had the emergence of the Government Digital Service and the Digital Transformation Office in Australia and various incarnations around the world. And I'll come to them in a moment. And there were some really great things that came out of them and also some really important lessons learned moving forward. Meanwhile, a lot of countries started making progress in their digitisation agenda, and that again got confused with digital transformation because reinventing, in some cases, century or millennia-old processes with technology is somewhat reinforcing the status quo perspective. So let's jump into it. So Gov as a platform, moving from digital iteration to digital transformation. The first thing I want to talk about is one of the lessons that came out of the Government Digital Service in the UK and the Digital Transformation Office in Australia was what they saw was a race to the top in user-centered design and in Agile. And it was really wonderful to see the previous speaker talk about gamification. When you think about why games are so successful, one of the key reasons, even though we never would have called it that back then, is because they're the perfect user-centered design application. The user is at the absolute center of that experience, and it's because of that we're so drawn in. And being a lifelong gamer, I absolutely commend people to start thinking about how we apply gamification, not just gamification, but games design into how we do government and indeed other things. So we saw a race to the top in terms of user-centered design and a race to the top in terms of Agile, and lots of agencies started doing it. When we first started at the Digital Transformation Office, we did a very large piece of work to analyse the user-centered design approaches and service design approaches across agencies. What we found is not something that you would find surprising. We found a lot of the user-centered design was from the lens, through the lens of the individual agency. So you ended up getting the scope of the user's experience sort of necessarily constrained. What we ended up seeing, unfortunately, was a lot of services built for which the entire back end of those services was still on the same old legacy or indeed siloed infrastructure, which meant that you got a user-centered design on day one that was hard to iterate, hard to transform, hard to respond to changing user needs moving forward, because the front end was part of the of a very large was not reusable. So the realization we came to in the DTO in those first heady 8 months of the interim DTO was that we needed to add reusable government. We needed to make government mashable. We needed to make the components of service delivery more modular so that they could be drawn together for the services for an individual agency, but then also be able to be pulled into many different channels for that service delivery, if you like. So then we also started understanding that there was a serious issue with the traditional approach to user-centered design and iteration. When you start with an MVP, which is based on a user's need or a key pain point, and then you continue to iterate and solve the individual problems, what you're actually doing, unfortunately, is reinforcing the status quo. So you end up with MVPs that are iterating, continually trying to just solve just the next small problem, and that iteration reinforces the underlying system, the underlying premise, the underlying approach. What happens if the 15 steps that are required for a particular service are actually completely removed by the ability for, you know, half of them or all of them or even just a sum of them to be able to be automated or done through a third party, or to have a user say, you know what, you could digitize each one of these so that it will make it easier, but why do I need to answer them at all? Why do you need to, for me to share that information with you when you could just validate my claim? You know, there's a whole bunch of opportunities when you step back and try to design how a system can work and how a system can support myriad different approaches to service delivery. I'll come to that a little bit more in a second, but the key learning, iteration without direction reinforces the status quo. Users have myriad needs, but government seeks single solutions. We see this over and over again. Even in the little team that we have here in New Zealand, it's been very interesting to pull together a true hybrid multidisciplinary team to explore this concept of Gov as a platform, because everyone on this team is uncomfortable, as they should be. If you're entirely comfortable with what you're building, then you're probably just building something comfortable. By having our technical people and our design people and our data people, you know, having these different disciplines really challenge each other on what or where we could go, everyone still starts to say, well, with all this information, here's the solution, here's the best solution, or here's the most desired solution, or here's the one that users most ask for. Every time we try to take this approach of deductive reasoning, we're losing the fact that different content may require different approaches. Rather than saying, let's build 20 services where there's one type of service for each thing, why wouldn't we start looking at multimodal services? So we had some really interesting insights come from our research here in New Zealand that showed that, you know, sometimes people actually just want to plan their own life with some information. Sometimes they want some guidance in and assistance in actually traversing what they're trying to do. You know, they actually want to apply for something or do something. And at that point, sometimes a conversational approach might be more appropriate. Sometimes people actually want things to be proactively provided to them. But any one of those three modes being assumed to be the only mode leads to problems, because none of them will solve everyone's problem. Not everything is proactively predictable. If you got a notice from government saying, we've noticed that you're pregnant and would you like some services, that would just be way on the other side of uncanny valley in terms of creepiness. At the same time, it's nice to be told that your driver's license is up for renewal or that your car registration is up for renewal. When you want to apply for something, you want to understand those interactions between agencies or between governments, so that if there's an incorrect piece of information that you have visibility of, you have the opportunity to actually correct that record and actually get the right service. So there's a whole bunch of opportunities here, but the key lesson that I guess we're taking out is that users have myriad needs, and those needs are going to continue to expand, but this challenge of government to seek single solutions is missing out on solving those myriad needs. This is a big one, a big realization for us. Distributed power requires a distributed approach to solutions. A lot of people say, well, government's not that big when you compare to a bank. And so the issue of size of government is quite often brought up as, you know, it's big but not that big, and you know, there's a whole question about that. But actually we need to scale for complexity. Assuming that government should be the only means of service delivery is to assume that government needs to provide for all, that needs to solve all the problems, needs to be right on the bleeding edge as well as, you know, solving the known problems. What if we actually explored a bit of a paradigm shift? One of the things I like to talk about quite often is how we're moving from a centrist to a distributed paradigm. And if government can see itself as just another node in the network rather than a king in the castle, suddenly we have the opportunity to leverage the fact to support, if you like, an ecosystem of service delivery. In countries like Australia and New Zealand and many of the or Westminster-derived systems where there is distributed power, you necessarily have distributed mandate, distributed motivation. Traditionally, and for a long time, and this has happened in Australia for a long time, we keep saying we need user-centred design, but to do user-centred design of service delivery in government is to presume that an agency and a minister will be naturally motivated to deliver half of another agency, another government, or indeed the private sector, be able to solve the fact that this need is limited to the mandate of a single agency. If we accept the fact that no agency or minister will be motivated and wanting to take on that because they're not mandated, they're not funded, and they're not supported, indeed, to start doing that, then we need to explore the idea of distributed solutions. We need to explore the idea that an agency can deliver value and an agency can deliver services, but can do it in a way that can enable other people to build a range of services on the back. It might be another agency, it might be another level of government. Imagine if all the federal government services, data, transaction services, business rules, imagine if all government business rules were available programmatically in the public domain so that people could actually start to build intermediary level of services, systems, analysis, applications for either directly for citizens or businesses, or indeed for for other customers. So we need to scale not just for size, for complexity, and the only way to scale for complexity is to open up the marketplace for open innovation and open development of those new solutions, analysis and services. So where we are today. From a user's perspective, it's a reasonable question. Where do I go? There's so many doors, there's so many redirections constantly. We keep building portals that redirect to 1,000 different places. Every user, as we all know, starts, as we all do, because a little bit of empathy shows you this, starts with usually a search engine, starts talking to their friends. We found in the research that we're doing around the life event that we're exploring in New Zealand, most people started with their bank as their primary source of information about retirement, which makes sense. A bank talks to you about money and talks to you about all kinds of different things. So the fact that the bank is their primary service provider, why aren't we providing more information and systems and context for banks to be able to improve that service delivery? Anyway, from a user's perspective, they end up quite often just being redirected through to an agency system, an agency service from a whole bunch of private sector or cross-government information sites. And sometimes those information sites are really helpful. Having a beautiful service that gives you a whole bunch of information certainly helps. It helps you plan your life, but it doesn't make the pain of transactions any less. You still have all those things to go through. So we want to move from these silos to integrated services is the language here in New Zealand. But and the idea here is if I can get you all, and it's very hard to do this not in person, but if I can get you all to start from the bottom of this diagram and sort of look at the little white clouds down there, if you can separate your service into the transactions, the business rules, the data, the content, and then separate those things from, if you like, the common capabilities, which might be your identity frameworks, your user consent frameworks, etc. If you can actually boil things down to the smallest possible component, which is what I like to refer to as a bit more of a Unix view of the world, small things that do small things well, that can then be pulled together into big things, rather than building monolith systems that do nothing particularly well, but the lowest common denominator. So by taking that more componentized view, all of those components can then fit somewhere on a spectrum of more secure to more open services. Obviously, you want to push as many as possible towards the open end of that spectrum, because the more things that can be open, the more open innovation, which means that companies and community organizations and non-government and non-profit and indeed even civic hackers can then innovate on the back of open systems for which they don't need to have a formal relationship with government. But you do have the opportunity with some secure services that either there are some things for which people will only want to do with government, or through trusted partners like potentially a bank or potentially another jurisdiction of government. State governments would be a wonderful opportunity. Imagine if all of the federal government aspects were actually consumable by the state governments, who are in an excellent position on the front line of service delivery to be able to innovate and meet the needs of citizens at that level. So then if you sort of draw your eyes up a little bit further, you get three opportunities. The first one is that agencies can actually, using their own APIs, using their own programmatic access to components, eating their own dog food, because if they don't, then you end up with orphaned APIs. But if agencies are separating the front end from the back end, they can now iterate their front end very rapidly and very responsively to the citizens' needs and changing user needs moving forward. We have a great case study of exactly that here in New Zealand from one of the biggest agencies here that will be published in a few weeks' time. So please keep an eye out for that. Indeed, for all of the work of what we're doing here in New Zealand. But then you have other government agencies can start to consume those things. You have trusted private or community consuming services from across the spectrum, and then you have unknown private or community organizations consuming open services, which could be, like I said, any of those. Even transaction services. A secure transaction service might be applying for an entitlement. An open transaction service might be reporting a pothole. Every one of these types of components could sit anywhere on this spectrum. But then you get the third, so that second opportunity of opening up to the marketplace. The third opportunity is you start to be able to have the opportunity for user consent-driven automation. Everything should be driven around user consent. And indeed, we've started playing with a new term in New Zealand, exploring the concept of user control. The problem with user consent as a term is that it implies that you wanted to do something to someone and you just need to get their consent first. User control is about putting genuine user control over their experience into their hands as part of your design. Anyway, there's a whole other conversation in there around privacy and consent, so I'll move on. So this spectrum of open to secure APIs, everything could be somewhere on that spectrum, and of course you need to be able to inform that and monitor that and be able to understand that through some sort of evidence base. All of these slides are actually available online, so I'll share that link on Twitter after this. So the goals of what we're doing here in New Zealand. Basically, we have a unique opportunity in New Zealand to explore stuff as a platform idea because they've done heaps of work prior to this little experiment. There's been heaps of work around what the technical foundations for federated services and integrated services could look like, and a lot of work trying to build integrated services, which has resulted in some wonderful outcomes for users. But some challenging outcomes from the perspective of technical debt. So there is a great desire to explore models of how this could work moving forward. So the outcomes so we're doing this 12-week experiment where we're testing, first of all, the Innovation Lab model. What happens when you take government services and you take teams from across private and public sector, cross-disciplinary teams that can come together into a neutral space, which is what the Innovation Lab is about. When you come to a neutral space, you've got a better chance that people will actually take an all-of-government, user-centered view that is not constrained to an agency view. And in my experience, both at the DTO and here in New Zealand and in other projects, it takes most public servants that I've worked with, and indeed even private sector people I've worked with, somewhere between 2 to 6 weeks to open their mind to being genuinely holistic in their view, because everyone usually doesn't realize just how constrained their thinking is because they're used to just working the way they're used to working. That's just how it is. So taking this Innovation Lab model as a way for rapidly designing and delivering integrated government services, that's the first thing we're testing. The second one is Gov as a platform, the federated services delivery model, and we're testing our technical and design assumptions and whether it would work. So it's very exciting. We're exploring a new operating model around that idea of scaling out to the broader government and non-government and profit and non-profit sectors being able to build on the back of service delivery. So in New Zealand, there's a group called the Citizen Advice Bureau, which is a non-profit run organisation which does, as the word, as the label says, advice to citizens. And it's a place that people can get information and guidance without having to go to government, which is very, very powerful. If they had access to authoritative information about all government services, authoritative information about life events, about conditions, about business rules, about the eligibility requirements of different things, then they would be an even more powerful frontline service delivery mechanism. Government should always provide a service like public roads, but the opportunity here is to be able to increase that diversity of service delivery. But we're also conducting design and discovery. We're actually building some future states. We're trying to look what could look like, which is very exciting. And there'll be some prototypes being released in a week or two. So I'm hoping to have them ready for today, but they're just still being finalized. Good look like in the purpose more the constraints of the current technology and the legacy systems in government. Then we have an opportunity to say, well, what are the functional requirements moving forward, giving us the ability to plan a work program to actually enable the future state. Again, iteration is the death of innovation. If you just iterate based on what you currently have, you will never transform. You will only ever iterate. Finally, you want to apply agile plus user design plus engineering, not just one or two of those three. And we're delivering at least one reusable component, which is looking like a services register, which we've already got several agencies and several other services inside and outside of government keen to reuse. Our planned outcomes, I won't jump into this too much. Basically, there's a bunch of analysis, there's a bunch of prototyping, a bunch of user research, not in that order. Obviously, everything we're doing here is based around user-centered design, but then we are coupling user-centered design and service design with, I guess, an engineering perspective, a technical perspective, with a data perspective, and with sort of information management perspective, and then combining that with a marketplace perspective. So we're really trying to get a few different things here. So there'll be some good outcomes here, not just for New Zealand, but by publishing all of our outcomes and publishing all of our insights and outcomes, we hope that this work will be useful all around the world. And I should take a moment, by the way, to reflect. We did a blog post the other day reflecting on Estonia as a comparison. The reason that's interesting is because if you look at Estonia and South Korea and Singapore and several of these other countries that have done an amazing job at digital government, the key thing to recognize there is that, first of all, they don't exist in the sort of environment that we have in Australia or New Zealand of distributed power. They're able to bring those things together into either a central agency or a central view quite effectively, because they don't have that competitive tension we have amongst agencies and amongst mandates and amongst jurisdictions even. But the other thing there is that they have effectively come up with digital government. They've been able to take the e-government approach and take that to the whole next level to make government digital, the government services to the public. The model that we're exploring, which is a little bit different, is the many doors, but no wrong door. The ability for the private sector and non-profit community sector to be able to build services on the back of government, not just government to citizens or government to business. So it is a massive experiment. It is distinct from those experiments because from our perspective, they are the natural conclusion of e-government. We are exploring government as a platform, which is subtly different. And indeed, we had the Estonia, a delegation from Estonia here, and when we told them what we're doing, they were very excited by it and were very keen to know more. And in fact, one of the responses was, "Oh, we should have thought of that," which was nicely validating. We've got interest from the UK, from the US, from Canada, from a few different places in what's happening here. And we even had the UK Chief Technology Officer, or now National Technology Advisor, Liam Maxwell here, saying to us that this is, from his perspective, the future of government service design. Anyway, moving forward, there's a lot of problems. There's looking at the problems from the people perspective, the agency perspective, and the private sector community perspective. I'll just quickly cover these. There's the problem for people about how to scale to the size and diversity of their problems. We've covered that. How to cater to different modes of delivery for different contexts. Quite often we sort of say, well, people want to log in first and then we'll tell them what they need. Well, that's not always the case. Generally, a lot of people want to actually talk to government last. We have that issue of being both the social workers and the cops. We have the genuine issue of, but people try to solve that. They say, oh, well, if they don't want to deal with it with us, let's try to make it easier for them to deal with us. Well, in some cases they don't want to, and that's okay. Enabling, the actual problem here to solve is how to make how to actually help build our society and our community, and how to actually serve that community best. And in some cases, the things that government is trying to be everything to everyone is actually not quite hitting the mark. Users just want things to be easier. They don't want to have to understand government and the complexity of government. They want more control over their experience. So there's a lot of problems, I guess, from a people's perspective. From an agency perspective, quite often they're asked to deliver services on behalf of the rest of government. They're asked to integrate, but there's no reference implementation. Particularly here in New Zealand, there was a lot of pressure on agencies and on service delivery teams themselves to do this. And yet, when they asked, okay, how, there wasn't really a lot of good, tangible examples or support beyond, I guess, technical guidance. Beyond very high-level technical guidance. So there's a lot of agencies starting to invest in APIs and channel strategies, but again, those are generally constrained to individual agency needs and not necessarily modular enough for them to be able to reuse themselves. Decision-making is split, obviously, for across functional lines, and you've often got a competitive tension between the design teams and the technology teams. Now, this is an old problem. IT departments have become basically seen in some cases fairly and in some cases unfairly as blockers to innovation. But at the end of the day, you can't innovate without technology. And technical evangelists, people that know technology, are actually your best allies when you can actually have them in the room, working with you, strategizing with you, designing with you. It's only by having them in the room at the design phase that you can actually have some good things going forward. And yet IT departments have been so underfunded for so many years that they've just become barricaded in their own sort of, little in just trying to keep the lights on. So we need to figure that out. That's a much bigger problem. But the fact is, decision-making is split along those functional lines. They're seen, design and tech are seen as being in competition with each other, and that's driving a serious wedge and inability for us to get the right outcome. Agencies are naturally constrained in scope and motivated by the individual budgets, as I mentioned before. Private sector problem, of course, it's just impossible for them to work with government. If they do with government, they tend to be told, well, you have to sign this NDA, you have to do all this bureaucracy and overhead, so it's impossible. So I'll leave that just for the moment. From our perspective, just a couple of last moments, because I've got a few minutes to go. User-centered design plus agile plus consumable government. We believe, and this is the hypothesis that we're experimenting with right now, and I can tell you, we went into this experiment, open to the idea it may not be the answer, but all of our preliminary findings and research and analysis and testing of that idea are coming out quite well and quite promising. So a lot of that will be shared quite soon. New Zealand right now, and I've sort of jokingly built in the tourism thing here, the best place to live. But right now, it's the best place to experiment with this because all of the conditions are lined up. In the federal government in Australia right now, there's certainly been a shift back to a more of a policy approach to this space, and so I think it's going to be a little while before that turns around, and that's completely fine. There's a lot of other very important work that needs to happen around transparency, around visibility, around spending and those kinds of things. But I think in the States, there's a lot of possibility to experiment and to opportunities to do that. I'm very excited to be here in New Zealand and part of this experiment right now because all the conditions here, right up to the very top of the government, are well aligned to actually give this experiment a red hot go. So next steps, I think probably given the time constraints, I just suggest you follow along and please let me know what you think. I'm on Twitter if you want to post some questions. I'll continue participating in the conversation. Looking forward to seeing the rest of how today goes and hopefully to coming along and actually seeing everyone in October, hopefully. So I'm just going to come back to my face just briefly. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to furthering the conversation on Twitter, and I'll hopefully see you all in Adelaide in October.